Good morning, students. In the earlier class, we discussed about language and freedom of speech. With regard to language and freedom of speech, we discussed about the Vernacular Press Act of 1878, which acts as a principal element which censored regional newspapers. And obviously, with the bringing up of Vernacular Press Act, the provisions were literally very stringent during those times, as local officers were given the power to demand bonds and deposits of money from printers and publishers, and the printing of objectionable material could lead to confiscation of the deposit as well as the machinery of the press with no right of appeal in the courts. That is complete control of local officers upon the publishing company. So much so that your work, which has some element of controversy with relation to Indian freedom struggle or with relation to British colonialism, the local officers have the power to censor it. So much so that most of the time these articles and these newspapers got a lengthy ban. So 4 years later, because of a lot of controversy regarding Vernacular Press Act, Lord Ripon tried to repeal the act, and a bitter feeling obtained among officials. Obviously, certain Europeans were completely against repealing the act because Ripon was trying to lessen the censoring that is bound to happen within the Vernacular Press Act. But Europeans were completely against it, and in 1890s, when the question of sedition acquired a new gravity, provisions were included in the regular penal law to allow the government to move against statements conducing to public mischief and promoting enmity between classes. So obviously, but all through these years there was some amount of reduction within the censor laws, but again Europeans and Britishers were of the view that it should be brought back. So till 1890s, this to and forth kind of banning newspapers, banning certain literature and public works has always been on the forefront. So the distinction by language had by then ceased to be a practical index of difference, because native publications in English could no longer be said to be confined in them influence to a class naturally intolerant of sedition. So the distinction by language had then been stopped to be a practical index of difference, because native publications in English could no longer be said to be confined in their influence to a class naturally intolerant of sedition. Because obviously, what happens is that almost all the regional languages which were publishing these seditious work were banned, not regional publications which were publishing under English. So obviously, there is this language difference that happened during the time. And through this language difference, the Britishers were trying to, not knowingly but unknowingly, they were trying to create a kind of a class difference. So other more practical means emerged to distinguish between proper members of civil society and those whom the state could recognize only as subjects, only citizens. And in any case, a contrary movement of nationalism was then well on its way to constituting its domain of sovereignty, rejecting the dubious promise of being granted membership of a second-rate civil society of subjects. So you cannot call the society during these times as a kind of a civil society, because it was a kind of a contrary movement of nationalism, and a contrary movement of nationalism was then well on its way to constituting its own domain of sovereignty, rejecting the dubious promise of being granted membership of a second-rate civil society of subjects. In the earlier chapters, we also discussed about what do you mean by a civil society, and how Britishers or Indians were not considered to be a byproduct of civil society, whereas Englishers considers themselves to be a byproduct of civil society. And the principal difference is because of the class difference. And that's the reason why they say Indians are not that organized. And since they are not organized, their government, their constitution, their rule of law, everything depends upon the social class structure, which obviously have some relation to religion and classes. and therefore you cannot call them as a proper civil society. Let's say if a government tries to make a decision, they take into consideration about the social classes, about the religion. But when it comes to the European continent, they don't give importance to these stuffs, because they give importance to the totality of the country, whether these things will do good to the country or not. That is given importance. That's the reason why Europeans call their society as a more well refined civil society and not the Indian society. So this is what has been discussed by medium of language in the section. So let's move on to the next section, which is regarding nationalism and colonial difference. Let's look at the word nationalism. What is nationalism and what is colonial difference? That is how nationalism has been treated by colonizer and the colonialism, by the colonizer and the colonized. That is both the ruler and the one who the ruler rules. So we entered the earlier section with talking about sovereignty. So we are again continuing that. This domain of sovereignty, which nationalism thought of as the spiritual or inner aspects of culture, such as language or religion, or the elements of personal and family life, was of course permitted upon a difference between the cultures of the colonizer and colonized. Even sovereignty depends upon the culture of colonizer and colonized. I think we have learned in the earlier 8th standard and 9th standard that what do you mean by sovereignty. So even the element of sovereignty is different in terms of the colonizer and also the colonized. So what Partha Chatterjee tries to say is that how can the sovereignty can be attained, or what is the aim to attain sovereignty? It is the inner domain of the state. Okay, inner domain of the state try to keep the colonizer away from the national life. That's what the summarizing of the whole paragraph is all about, that the inner domain of the state. What do you mean by inner domain? I think we have to go back to the first section where we talked about there is a spiritual domain is there, and also there is a material domain. This is what you call as inner domain and outer domain. Let's discuss about what do you mean by the outer domain of the state. So outer domain of the state, which is obviously the material domain state, which is law, administration, economy, statecraft, nationalism, fought relentlessly to erase the marks of colonial difference. Difference could not be justified in that domain. That is, how can we differentiate between the law which has been made by the Britishers and also the law and the administration made by Indians? It's not easy. So in the material domain, you cannot come up with this colonial difference, that this has been created by Britishers, this has been created by Indians. It is not possible. Now let's look at the inner domain. So in this, it seemed to reassertingly precisely the claims to universality of the modern regime of power. And the end, by successfully terminating the life of the colonial state, nationalism demonstrated that the project of that modern regime could be carried forward only by superseding the conditions of colonial rule. So, and in the end, by successfully terminating life of colonial state. That is just forgetting about what the colonizer had taught us. Nationalism demonstrated that the project of that modern regime could be carried forward only by superseding the conditions of colonial rule. We have discussed about the same element which has been repeated again and again. That is how we can become a modern regime of power. That is only by superseding. It's not like forgetting. By superseding means transcending. Obviously, the rule of conduct which has been followed or been prescribed by the Britishers, we have been using it for eternity. But even after the Britishers left India, their rule of law changed, or their way of approaching the rule of law changed, and they started updating themselves, especially in terms of the rule of law. But whereas Indians has only been able to follow that colonial rule, they are not able to supersede that colonial rule and have never come up with something which is more new, or let's say innovative within their within their rule. And that's the reason why even today you can call it as a shadow of colonial rule. And that's what Partha Chatterjee tries to tell us through this two stating of two states, that is inner domain and outer domain. So then next paragraph at the middle. The consolidation of the power of the national state has meant that the making of a new set of differences within post-colonial society. That's an important one. The consolidation of the power of the national state has meant that the marking of a new set of differences within post-colonial society. But the origin of the project of modernity in the workings of the colonial state has meant that every such historical claim that has had to negotiate its relationship with the history of colonialism. The writing of the history of British India continues to this day to be a matter of political study. Actually, that line is the summing of that entire paragraph. That is, the writing of the history of British India continues to this day to be a matter of political struggle. That whenever we study about British India, we talk about only the political struggle. We don't talk about the social struggle between the classes and also between different religions. So therefore, to show the continued relevance of the question of the universality. So what is being discussed here is about the universality of the modern regime of power and also of the rule of colonialism. That is, whether the modern regime of, there is any universal system within the modern regime of power. Whether India follows the same modern regime of power as that of US, UK or any other European countries, and of the rule of colonial, and also about the rule of the colonial difference. But this can only be proved, or let's say substantiated, by revising the history of colonialism in India. So obviously that leads to our next section, which is it never happened. Now, it never happened is a justification, or let's say answer to this nationalism and colonial difference, and to prove that what is the difference that we see within the nationalistic beliefs of India and also upon the Europe. So it never happened means maybe the rule never happened, the history of colonialism or colonialism itself never happened, or even formulating rules for Indian subcontinent, it never happened. So let's move on to the next chapter. This revisionist history, that revising history in terms of in terms of, or from the point of view of the colonizer and the colonized, begins by challenging the assumption shared by both colonialist and nationalist historiographies that, this is the point, colonial rule represented a fundamental break in Indian history. Okay, that is, begins by challenging the assumption that it is been a major assumption that colonial rule represented a fundamental break in Indian history. Obviously, prior to the British government and their rule, India had its own history of regional rulers. After the coming up of colonial rule, that is even before Britishers, you have a European history. But that is completely wrong. That's what historians say. And there are three divisions for that argument. And the first argument is been put forward by Burton Stein, which is given in the second paragraph. Now, Burton Stein disputes the assumption in both imperialist and nationalist historiographies that British regime in India was completely different from all prior states. Now, he is completely against the viewpoint that British regime in India was completely different from all the prior states. That is, the way Britishers ruled in India is the same as that of France or any other major, Australia or New Zealand. That's what Burton Stein says. It is the same form of rule. It is the same form of administration. There is not much difference. Now, this has been supported. The recent work of Christian Bale, David Bashbrook and Frank Perlin shows, he says that early colonial regimes were continuations of prior indigenous regime. That is when Britishers ruled India, or let's say Arabs came to India, Dutch came to India. They never formed their own rules. They instead continued the indigenous or the native ruling forms of India. That's what the works of David Washbrook and Frank Perlin says. Not of chaos and the decline, and that the period from 1750 to 1815 was a period of transition from extant old regimes to colonial regimes. That if you look at 1750 to 1850, it was a period of transition. You have this old regimes of great rulers of India, and suddenly there is a shift into the colonial regime. The continuations were marked in two ways. One structural contradiction in this is, in pre-British state formations was between centralizing militaristic regimes and numerous local lordships. That is, prior to the coming of British government in India, the Indians believed in a centralizing militaristic regime. That is, the ruler acquires the centrality or the power. And obviously, along with the ruler, there are numerous local landlords or lordships. There is a king, and obviously he is in charge of different lordships. The British inserted themselves into these formations not as outsiders with new procedural principles and purposes, but contingently as part of the political system of the subcontinent, but possessed of substantially more resources to deploy for conquest than others. The British, what they did is that they haven't changed this division. They have kept the division. But what they have done is that they have kept this division and inserted into the Indian administrative, or let's say Indian militaristic regime, their own principles. Let's say the king is the central authority. What the Britishers did is that they never defeated the king or anything. They just tried to exchange trades with the king. And by doing business with the king, they accumulated, or let's say they have a complete control over the trade system. And by having complete control over the trade system, they had control over the king. So the king's power lessened during the course of this business. And through the medium of the king, they ruled the entire India. The best example I can give you, a local example, would be the scenario that you see in the film Lagan, where the lordship or the king is there, but the king is not making the decision. It is the Britishers who makes the decision, but the king is there only as a middleman between the farmers and also from the British, between the farmers and the Britishers. That's how it is. So they haven't changed the structure. They have only inserted their principles into that structure, and this is the best way for conquest. That's the agenda of Britishers during those times. The colonial state resolved the contradiction in favor of the centralizing tendency of military fiscalism inherited from previous Here lay the continuity of the colonial state with its predecessors. That is, what they have done is that they have resolved the contradiction in favor of centralizing tendency of military fiscalism inherited from previous regimes. That is, military fiscalism means that the ruler is in charge of complete, that is, the military is in charge, or let's say through conquests and through waging war against different region, you are accumulating money to the government. This is what you call as military fiscalism, that is, gaining money and materials through warfare. So what the Britishers did is that they have adapted this military fiscalism of yesteryear regimes and adopted it to their own advantage. So therefore, here lay the continuity of the colonial state with its predecessors, and in that way you can say that the colonial state, what they were doing is that they were only following the earlier rule of the government, but in a different way. That's the reason why historians say that India has been ruled not differently by Britishers. Britishers used India and its politics and its administrative technique, and they have used it to their advantage. They haven't changed, obviously they have inserted certain principles into the government and tried to change it in a different way, but all through, if you look at the whole administration, it has always been the same. See, the other contradiction, that is the contradiction in support of this argument, is sultanism, which is obviously Max Weber's term. Obviously, he has written about India, which implied a patrimonial order based on personal loyalty of subordination to the ruler. That before Britishers, there was this sultanism, that is, every subject should be loyal to the king. That's what you call as patrimonial order. The patrimonial order is given more importance based on personal loyalty of subordination to the ruler. Everybody who is against the ruler, or everybody is subordinated to the ruler. The ruler is the central. He attains more prominence, and the existence of ideological discontinuities between ruler and local lordships, which made such patrimonial loyalties hard to sustain. But another problem is that everybody wants to be a king. As you already know, India is like a princely states. Different states has been merged together to become, to make India, and it has been made by none other than Britishers. So obviously, the local lordships had their own ambitions, their own disagreement with the lord or the ruler, and everybody wanted to become the ruler. So you cannot say that every local lordship was completely loyal to the ruler. In fact, patrimonial sultanism was incompatible with the economic tendencies inherent in military fiscalism. That is, inherent in military fiscalism, that is, waging war to get money, and patriarchal sultanism doesn't go together. Now, if you want to wage war against different regions, obviously it is more a kind of an oligarchical way. That is, if you want to rule the entire land, you have to continue with the order of a patrimonial sultanism. That is, you are the father of almost every local district, or let's say region in your kingdom, and you are the one who should be looking after them rather than conquering them. But the agenda of the Britishers was completely different. They believed in military fiscalism. That means that conquer every region so that you get money out of it, you get material out of it. So patrimonial sultanism and military fiscalism, these are two different things. It never goes hand in hand. That's what Britishers had found out. They cannot attain both together, and that's the reason why they had a kind of an office, or let's say the official way of dealing things. Rather than giving complete supremacy to the king, they had offices, they have governor generals, they have lords, they have subedars, etc. To look after different fields of power. After initial hesitations, the colonial state in the second half of the 19th century broke entirely with the sultanist forms and founded a regime based not on patrimonial loyalties but on modern European principles, different both from the old regimes and the early colonial regimes. Here lay the discontinuity of the later colonial state with its predecessors, and how colonial regime, that is later colonial state with its predecessors, that is how the predecessors of the British, let's say Dutch or French or whoever who tried to conquer India, you cannot say India but at least parts of India, their regime was completely different from the British regime because of one reason, and that is the colonial state in the second half of the 19th century, that is obviously the Britishers, is the colonial state. Britishers who are ruling the Indian state is called as colonial state. In the 19th century or the second half of the 19th century, broke entirely with the sultanist form. They never took into consideration that in the 19th century or before the 19th century, they took certain forms of sultanism into consideration, that is the ruler as the principal objective. But after 1900s or second half of the 19th century, which obviously might be after the 1857 mutiny, founded a regime based not on patrimonial loyalties. They focused not on ruler, and they expected no loyalty from local lordships, but on modern Europe. They ruled India from the second half of the 19th century. They started ruling India entirely based on European principles. different both from the older regimes and the earlier colonial regimes, that their rule of law was completely different from their predecessors, which might be the French or the Dutch. Now here lay the discontinuity of the later colonial state with this, and that's why British rule is different in India. അത് പറയാൻ കാരണം അതാണ്. Okay, this is what has been tried to attain in this section. I think we will stop it for today. Rest we'll do it tomorrow. Thank you.